if you're focusing on the control piece of it, you're losing the focus on what is best for your child.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Family law is complicated. Among the various issues and filings, you have things like visitation petitions and custody petitions and prenuptial agreements and even postnuptial agreements. Moreover, family law exists within an evolving society where perspectives and opportunities and technologies are constantly changing and influencing the outcomes. This is why I was excited to have Kelly Scott on the podcast. As a seasoned attorney with a leadership role within the family law community, Kelly is a careful observer of family law trends. Kelly and I discuss those trends and how they potentially affect kids. Talking About Kids is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. If you think the information in this episode might benefit families you know, please like the Talking About Kids podcast and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. And now the interview.
I had sort of a crooked path to being a family lawyer, as I call it, because I went to law school wanting to be a public defender. That was always what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer from the time I was like in fourth grade. And I knew I wanted to do criminal law. It's all I ever wanted to do. I didn't think about anything else. I didn't even take a family law class in law school. And for reasons that I won't bore you with, I couldn't land a public defender job when I graduated. And I sort of happened into a clerkship at the Regional Family Trial Docket in Connecticut, which is our state's centralized, highly contested custody docket. And it's a trial only docket. So it is a place where any court in the state, if it has a highly contested custody case that's going to require, 5, 6, 7+ days of trial, they would send it to this centralized court. And that court would try the case and make a decision, and that would be the end of it. So I had the opportunity to see the best family lawyers and mental health professionals, because in order to get into this docket, there had to either be a guardian ad litem or there had to be a forensic custody evaluation that was done. So I was then getting to observe those people also testify. There was also a forced mediation component of it. So any case that was referred there, before you would go to trial, you would have a full day mediation with volunteer attorneys and mental health professionals. One was always a man, one was always a woman, and it just sort of depended on how we paired people. But that was done intentionally. And the goal would be to try to actually settle the case through that program. And if not, then the judges there would try it. But so it opened my eyes to a whole new world, literally, because I realized then that there were a lot of similarities actually between why I wanted to be a public defender and being a family lawyer. Primarily helping people, not being behind a computer looking at contracts all day, every day. That's not why I wanted to go to law school. Really having that people focus push. And then also the similarities at times of when someone's in the criminal justice system, it's often the worst experience of their life. And when people are getting divorced, it is often the worst experience of their life. And to have the ability to then help those people navigate that, that's why I wanted to be a public defender. And it just sort of worked out for me that it made, therefore, a lot of sense. So I did that for about a year. I got in touch with a lawyer who actually had a case that I clerked for the judge while I was there, that connected me with another lawyer who was looking for help.
Right.
And I have, it's all I've done my whole career. And I enjoy it. It's certainly not for everyone.
Right.
Which probably any divorce lawyer that you talk to,
Right.
and even if you haven't, you probably get that sense. But I really find myself enjoying and finding it being rewarding to
Mm.
have that direct, people contact and helping people through, what is often one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult things that they've ever gone through.
Well, we have been fortunate on talking about kids that we've had some previous guests talk a little bit about creating what they would call like a family centered or child centered divorce process. So, if listeners are interested in going back and listening to Karen McNenny or to Charles Jameson, they definitely take that approach. And I know it's an approach you take as well. And lately, you've been writing and talking about some trends that you've been seeing in family law and in divorce proceedings, um, that go both ways, that help families and that harm families, and sometimes could go either way themselves, right?
Mhm.
This trend has the potential to go both ways. I think I want to talk about the negatives first, or what I perceive to be the negatives, having read a little bit about what you've published in particular about use of social media in and around a divorce proceeding. So, what can you tell my listeners about the good and the bad of internet and social media when it comes to your family during this stage?
Sure. So I would say primarily if you are in the process of divorce or if you are in the process of a custody litigation of any kind, stay away from social media.
Yeah.
That's sort of the number one. Stay away from social media. And I mean that not just in your personal use of it, but also in using it to then try to find information or stories or resources. Okay, sure, you can use the internet to find resources. That's totally fine and normal, right? But you have to have a certain amount of skepticism in what you are looking at and what you're
Mm.
finding. Because I find that, when clients go to the internet as a source of information, if you're not looking at it with a healthy dose of skepticism, you can be totally taken by something that has no bearing in reality, right? And I think
Mm.
that's especially true with the advent of AI. And you can't really trust anything on the internet these days, right? Because there's so much
Right.
AI generated information out there that doesn't even have truth to it, literally doesn't have any truth to it. So I think don't use it. But if you are going to use it, the number one rule, do not post about your situation
Okay.
at all. You don't want anyone else seeing it. You do not want your quote unquote adversary
Mm.
or your co-parent or your co-parent's lawyer. If you're not in if you're not in a mediation scenario and you're not in a very collaborative approach and you are in a litigious adversarial approach, you don't want to put something out there that the other side is then going to be able to use to their advantage because
Right.
you went on social media and posted a hate message about, your child's other parent,
Yeah.
whoever that might be, or even, your child's teacher or anything related to your child, really, right? So you have to be really careful about that. One of the things that I tell clients regularly, in an adversarial situation or not, is assume that anything you say and do is going to go in front of a judge.
Right.
You have to have that assumption. And if you have that assumption, the hope is that you're then not going to put that really negative thing out there, or you're going to think twice as to the tone of something that you might send to your spouse or your co-parent, because those things matter. I can't tell you how many times I've had cases where one of the things I've asked for in a discovery request is give me all of the emails that you've sent to so and so's teacher.
Mm.
And I then get a gold mine of messages where that party was lambasting the other party to
Right.
the child's teacher.
Yeah.
um just, you don't want to do it. You don't want to be that person. You don't want to do it, and you don't want to have to answer about it if you are in a courtroom one day and someone's putting those in front of you. So I think definitely use it with caution for sure. And that doesn't mean you can't continue to use it in the ways that you would have
You were
before or
before.
you will
Right.
after, right? It's a glimpse into people's lives, and if people utilize it for that purpose and they're posting, cute first day of school pictures or happy birthday
Right.
posts, totally fine, right? But make sure you're doing it in an appropriate way. I say that's a general rule, right? That's not just
Right.
a rule when you're going through a divorce or a custody dispute, but especially in that context, right? Because what we also have to remember is the internet is there forever, right? It's not
Right.
going anywhere. And one day, your children are going to Google themselves or you or your
Right.
co-parent, and you don't want them to see what you were putting out there in maybe your worst moments, right? You don't want to live with that regret. And just don't do it.
No.
So I think that's really important.
Well, and it just it aligns with so much other research and so much other advice from so many child advocates and research. You never want to be seen as undermining the other parent.
Mhm.
Y- and it's natural and it's understanding. And as you pointed out, this is a moment of tremendous anxiety, of tremendous adversity that you might be facing, and the desire to say something against this person who might have hurt you could be really strong. But ultimately, I think you have to keep the kid focused and know that anything, like you said, that you post or that you say, your kid might see one day, and that will hurt them. But I am curious about something, though, that you pointed out about seeking information about a divorce. So, what sort of bad advice about a divorce are people getting from dubious sources online?
So I think it's not necessarily bad advice, but
Okay.
it is the one in 100, 500, a
Mm,
1,000 advice, right? So,
okay.
oh, my neighbor told me that she knows someone who, when they got divorced, she got all of the assets and the other parent got no parenting time.
Wow.
Why
There you go.
can't that happen in my case?
Right.
Well, without knowing anything about that other case that your neighbor is telling you about, I can tell you that is very unusual.
Right.
And probably, if it is even true that it happened in the way that it's being described, there were some very significant facts in that case
Yeah.
that resulted in that outcome. And that is not usually the norm, right? It's kind of like the peanut gallery that we sometimes talk about in my world too, of everybody has a peanut gallery that they go to, that they talk about their issues with, what's going on in their world and all of that, right? It's not dissimilar in some ways to what the internet doctors, right, and trying to diagnose ailments through Google searches, right?
Right.
It may help, it may give you some semblance of things to look for, questions to ask, behaviors to maybe be aware of, but you're probably not getting it from professionals. And if you are involving professionals in your case, rely on the professionals, right?
Right.
You're doing that for a reason. And they do this for a living. They know what they're talking about. And trust them more than you're trusting your internet research or what your, friend's neighbor's kid went through 5 years ago, and it's not everyone's well intentioned, right? I look at it that way. I never assume nefarious motives for any of this, but there is a danger to it, and you have to be able to say to yourself, yep, I get it. I hired a lawyer. I'm going to listen to my lawyer.
Right.
And if you don't have that trust with your lawyer, maybe you
You
don't
need
have
a
the right
different lawyer.
lawyer. Right,
Exactly. That's
exactly.
exactly right.
Exactly. And that's totally fair too, right? Like I think we as lawyers have to, you know, tell ourselves and remind ourselves sometimes that this is a very personal,
Hmm.
area of the law, and it's a very
Hmm.
personal relationship that you build sometimes with your clients because of the nature of the subject matter. And I may not be the right fit for everyone. That's okay. Doesn't make me a bad lawyer. It doesn't make me a good lawyer. It doesn't make me a bad
No.
person. It just means maybe we don't have the right fit and somebody else might have a better fit with you. And if that's the case, then you should go explore that. You would be doing yourself as a client a disservice to not do that.
Well, I think that, it also is, since it's such a time of extreme vulnerability on the part of the adults involved, that these opportunities to kind of regain power in weird ways
Hmm.
might seem comforting. And I'm borrowing that just from what we know about in the trauma literature about trauma in children, right? The idea that gaining a little bit of control, if that's with additional information or a new trick or this insight that they gain this way, kind of helps get that feeling of power back that was lost maybe in the information that was shared about them in disclosure or something like that.
Well, and you raise an interesting point on sort of that trying to gain back control,
Yeah.
because that's a phenomenon that you see in divorces a lot. And
Right.
it is a phenomenon, speaking of kind of things that impact children, that tend to hurt children in the
Yeah.
context of a divorce. Because if you are more focused on wrestling control back or trying to get control because you haven't had it, right? So
Yep.
sometimes we see this dynamic where, in an intact family, there's different roles that people play, right? And there's different divisions of labor. And sometimes one parent takes on more of the parenting responsibility in certain ways than the other parent does. And when they're together, that works for them and that's fine, right?
Right.
And then when they are now separating and they're no longer going to be an intact family, they start to wrestle over those old roles instead of realizing that they have to figure out what their new roles in their new dynamic are going to be. So, for
Yeah.
the parent who always did certain things, they are trying to keep that control. And for the parent who didn't, they're trying to, wrestle
Get some of that.
control away
Right.
from the other parent because they never did it. And if you're focusing on the control piece of it, you're losing the focus on what is best for your child
Right.
in this dynamic. And you are fighting your issues in your marriage, not your what's best for your child.
Right.
It happens all the time. People use their children to fight their relationship issues.
Right.
And that's not what's best for the child.
Right. Well, and they treat the process as an end. Like if I get this amount of compensation and I get this custody arrangement, I've won, finish line, it's done. And, I know enough about your work that you recognize that's really just the beginning for families, is what happens with that. They have to live beyond whatever gets decided in that courtroom. and that's important to think about.
Yes.
It, in fact, one of the things that you advocate for, and I have to admit, I don't know a lot about this, but I'm really intrigued, is this post-nuptial agreement. I'm inferring from the name that that talks about how you handle moments like this down the road when you're still a couple early on in your marriage.
So it can, not
Okay.
always. So postnup by its name means it's an agreement that you enter into after you're already married.
Right.
So there's prenuptial agreements which you enter into before marriage, and there's postnuptial agreements which you enter into after you're married. Postnuptial agreements in most states, you cannot deal with parenting type issues.
Okay.
They're void as against public policy, as it's known, because courts don't want people contracting for what's going to happen with their children. It feels a little icky in that
Okay.
way, before they even know what's potentially going to happen down the road. But it's a tool that a lot of people use to address financial tension points, so to
Okay.
speak. And in that way, it can benefit children because it can take out of their parents'
Mm,
relationship a source of tension, that then might potentially lead to a divorce down the road, right?
right.
So it is a tool that conceptually is utilized at times to actually keep marriages together, because there is sometimes either a power imbalance or a financial
Mm,
imbalance where one party is feeling really vulnerable and is saying, I'm not sure if I can continue in this relationship with this dynamic, whatever it might be. And postnups are a way that people can try to solve that problem. Whatever the problem is that's causing the tension and causing the vulnerability, if both sides are aligned on fixing it and can come to terms on how to do that, you can then live the rest of your life, perhaps, as a married couple.
yeah, Kelly, do you have an example? I'm trying to think about like what you might put in a postnuptial agreement. So, what are some examples of things that you've seen go into successful postnuptial agreements?
Sure. So sometimes it is, say one spouse has started a company,
Hmm.
and no one really knows what the company is going to do. They've worked for a really long time building it. There hasn't been a huge monetary investment in it, but there's been a lot of time and energy and effort into
Right.
it. And next thing you know, it turns into something super valuable, and or has the potential to turn into something
Right.
super valuable. Somebody develops a software that they're about to sell to a bigger company for, multi-millions of dollars. And that person then starts to say, wait a second. Then if I get divorced down the road, all of that hard work and energy that I put into building this in the moment, I'm potentially going to have to share equally with my spouse who didn't, wasn't
Mm,
doing all those late nights and making all those, efforts. Um, and how do we address that? Well,
hmm.
one of the ways you potentially address it is you say that person is going to keep the rights to that, intellectual property or whatever it might be. And the other person is therefore going to get X amount of dollars instead, basically. So you kind of take that lightning rod out of the equation because you then know,
Okay.
here's how we're going to handle it. If we end up getting divorced, it's not going to become a problem because we've already dictated how we're going to handle it. Other times you see it where there's, one party has all of the financial assets in his or her
Mm,
name and the other party doesn't have any. And that has become a source of tension between people in their marriage. And they say, look, I don't really want to get divorced over this. I want to
right.
figure out a way that we can move forward in our marriage, a lot of times because you have children,
Right.
without having this constant fight about money that we seem to be having. How can we address it?
Okay.
You can address it through a postnup. You can address it through saying, here's how we're going to deal with money in the event of a divorce, and that way we don't have to worry about it. I don't
Mm.
have to feel vulnerable about the fact that I don't have access to any funds because I know that I'm going to be provided for in the event that happens in the future.
Do you ever see it used where one spouse has made professional sacrifices for the advancement of the other's career, be that supporting them through grad school, or didn't take a promotion so they could move and give the promotion for their spouse, that sort of thing? Do you ever see a postnup used to make people feel okay that, I'm recognizing the sacrifice that you've made, and we're going to put it down in writing that I recognize that you gave up that opportunity for me, and I don't want it to be a source of tension. I don't want you to ever feel compromised by it.
Yeah, sometimes that is in essence what it is doing, and
Right.
sometimes that's even what you're doing on a prenup as well. Of,
Right.
there's been a long-term partnership before you've even gotten married, and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, now we're getting married, and the party who, gave up their career,
Mhm.
moved across the country to support whatever endeavor. Now we're getting married. You're about to start your lucrative career. uh, how am I going to be compensated for that, given that it was pre-marriage and technically that doesn't factor in, right? So yes, that's a common phenomenon, because oftentimes the person who then made those professional sacrifices is the person who is economically then in a less advantaged situation. So they want to make sure that if something does happen down the road in their marriage, they're not going to be penalized for the fact that
Right.
they made those sacrifices early on to enable the other person, to continue to earn, or to, go to med school, for example. And they were the ones that then stayed working all those years. But once that person became a doctor, they
Right.
moved across the country and they had to, upheave their
Uproot. Exactly.
lives, to accomplish that. So yes, anything you can do almost anything from a financial perspective in a
Okay.
prenup or a postnup. Children, like I said, are more off limits.
Mm.
But from a financial perspective, you can address anything. I mean, and they can run the gauntlet. Sometimes you see prenups or postnups that address every single financial circumstance that could potentially
Mm.
be impacted in the event of a divorce. Other times you see them because the person solely wants to address one specific issue, right? So we see them a lot with people who either have family owned businesses that they have an interest in or expect to have an interest in, or people who expect inheritances, for example.
Okay.
And they say, look, I don't, anything we earn in our marriage together, fair game, right? But I don't want my 100-plus-year-old family company's interest to then
Divided
become a
up.
negotiating point
Yeah.
in a divorce, because
Yeah.
that's not fair to the hundreds of other people in my
Right.
family that have built that business.
And there's probably a good chance in a scenario like that that some of the pressure isn't coming from within the relationship, but from outside, and this is a way to deal with it as well.
Oftentimes
Yeah.
it is coming from outside the
Okay, that's
relationship.
making more sense now. Um, you know, um, you also have thought a lot about monitoring kids and how people monitor their kids, because we talked earlier about not using social media to put down your spouse. Implicit in what you're saying also is just stay off of it. Don't stalk the spouse. Don't just stay away. But let's talk about monitoring kids using things like air tags and phones. Where do people go wrong and what do they do right?
Sure. So I think that it always comes back to what's the motivation, right?
Okay.
Because this is a hot button issue for kids in general, right? It
Right.
doesn't even have to be in the cases of divorce. Social media and use of phones, it's everywhere these days. You
Right.
can't, you can't avoid it almost. And if you have parents who are aligned, aligned in what they want to do from a protecting their children perspective when it comes to social media and tracking and devices, then that's easy, right?
Right.
You have a co-parenting discussion, you figure it out, and you have the same focus, and the focus is on what's best for the child, and it has nothing to do with what's happening with the other parent. In a more dangerous side of things,
Mhm.
you are trying to track in order to gain some kind of information or advantage
Right.
against the other parent. And that's where people can get themselves into trouble,
Okay.
for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes there's a domestic violence component to it, right? Which is, of course, an extreme situation,
Right.
but if there's some history of coercive control and people are then using, they're planting an air tag in their child's sneaker to then track the whereabouts of the other spouse, that's a
Right.
major major issue, and that's a big no-no. And at least in Connecticut, you could get a restraining order against a person who you know conducts themselves in that
Right.
fashion. Um, but even less nefarious than that, right? Sometimes people say, well, I don't really trust that my co parent is telling me the truth
Mhm.
about where they're taking my child. So I'm going to put that air tag on them so that I can see independently that they're
Right.
doing what they say they're doing. That's also not a good thing, right? There's To have a successful co-parenting relationship, there has to be a certain level of trust between people. And if you don't have that, you're going to
Right.
have a hard road ahead of you. So that's a place where we're starting to see people
Hmm.
get themselves into trouble. Um, even just like the cell phones themselves, right? Or like these days for little
Yeah.
children, and you don't want them to get a cell phone, there's like these gizmo watches and other
Yeah.
kinds of devices that enable parents to have contact with a child but don't have all of the smartphone capabilities that you then have to worry about parental controls and internet and social media and things like that. But even those watches, there can be elements of giving access to information that
Mm.
one party or the other, again, if they don't both have pure motivations, could be trying to use for leverage purposes or to gain information. Um, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the concept of joint legal custody, which
Yeah.
is making major decisions about the children and having to do that together. And a lot of the dialogue around these issues right now is this the kind of thing that is a joint custodial decision? So, do I have to agree with my co parent if I am going
Mm.
to put an air tag on my child somewhere? Do I have
Yeah.
to agree with my co parent if I'm going to put a Life 360 app on their cell phone so that I can see where they are at all times? Um, and there's no black and white answer on that right now. Some parents and in some cases we're getting really granular in parenting plans where we're actually incorporating these kinds of things now
Okay.
into agreements. Usually you're only able to accomplish that if everybody is aligned in what they want to do. Otherwise you're going to hear from the other side, no, that's not joint legal custody. We don't need
Right.
to, we don't need to account for that. But I think it's a gray area. I would always say to people, if it's a close call, then the right answer is tell your co-parent, have a conversation, right? If you're not sure whether you can do this without their permission, then have the conversation, right? Don't there's the motto, ask forgiveness, not
Yeah.
permission. I
But
think
not
in
in
a
this
co
case.
in
Right.
a co-parenting context, you want to do the opposite in most instances. Um, so it's becoming a very common conversation that people are having, even as simple as when you get cell phones for
Right.
children, right? That's another thing. Is that a joint custodial decision? A lot of people would say yes, because this is something that has the potential to have a lasting impact on your child. And generally speaking, that's how we define joint custodial decisions, is
Mm.
not day-to-day decisions, but decisions that have a lasting impact or that impact more than one day in a child's life.
You know, a trend that you've witnessed that I'm not familiar with, but that to me requires a tremendous amount of trust and communication is bird nesting. Tell me a little bit about bird nesting because I only see pitfalls when I read. I mean, not from a kid perspective, but I only see um, the impediments to making it work well. So what is bird nesting, Kelly?
So bird nesting is, if you think of the term itself and you think of an actual bird nest, the bird, puts the eggs in the nest, and then the mom bird and dad bird go in and out of the nest bringing things and all of that.
Yeah.
And so in the family law context, bird nesting is the children stay in the house and mom stays in the house on mom's days, other mom stays in the house on other mom's days, or dad stays in the house on dad's days. And the children stay in the same place,
Wow.
and the two parents come and go. So you are right that there
I
is
mean,
a
again,
lot of
stopping right there, right? Just stopping there for a moment. That is awesome from a kid perspective. We can see
yes.
all the benefits. They get to stay in the same school. They get to have the security of being in that same space, of not having to move, having their things around them, those transitional objects, and all the comforts that exist in a kid's room or should to help them uh, develop positively. But the logistics of it to me seem difficult in the financial side of it too, because you go from maintaining 2 residents to potentially maintaining 3. You started with 1, you had the divorce, and now you're maintaining 3, but you've seen it work apparently.
So I would say more commonly you see bird nesting before parties are divorced.
Okay.
It is very rare, although it has happened. I've had cases where it's happened, where parties agree to bird nest after their divorce for at
Okay.
least a period of time. But it is much more common while people are getting divorced.
Okay.
And sometimes it's because they don't want to separate homes
Mhm.
officially until they have more clarity on what the circumstances are going to be. So
Right.
when you are getting divorced, if you're not sure, for example, that you're going to be able to both stay in the same general area of where you've been living, you don't necessarily want one party to go buy another house in that same area if
Right.
the other party then is going to say, wait a second, I'm not going to wind up being able to afford to stay in this area. I need to move to a different town.
Mm.
And then the parent who then bought the other house is like, well, wait a second, I bought my house because I thought we were staying here, right? So sometimes people utilize it as a way to not have to commit longer term to what the more permanent situation is going to look like. Um, and because they want the kids to continue to stay in the same place so that they don't have to disrupt the children once, twice, or potentially three times either because they're moving several times while the divorce is pending.
Right.
So conceptually, it is more likely than not before a divorce happens.
Okay.
And the benefits are exactly what you've identified, basically, that the burden is then not on the children to have to deal with any of the logistics, but the burden is on the parents. But you are absolutely right that it is ripe for pitfalls. So you have to have the right case in order to make bird nesting work. You have to have the people who have pure motivations, who are very focused on their children. There are definitely financial ramifications to it.
Mhm.
So generally speaking, there have to be a certain amount of means for people and able to afford bird nesting. But there also has to be a lot of trust between the co-parents and respect between the co-parents.
Right.
because otherwise you see boundary pushing and, little things that are intended to be disrespectful. It's the end of one parent's time and they leave the dish full of dirty, the sink full of dirty dishes rather, and
Right.
the dishwasher, full, and food, left out on the counter. So it's that kind of stuff that then eats away at the respect and the boundaries that are the crux of bird nesting. um
It also seems like it might be a place to kind of workshop some of the practices that you're going to have post divorce, and you just give you a better understanding in a place where the kids are still safe, because some of those issues, or when it's parent A's time, there's no television rules, and then it swaps over, and I see them watching junk that they don't get to watch when I'm there, or eating. I mean, food issues I know are a big deal when it comes to divorces as well. So it seems like it has the potential to let you try out some of that. What is it going to be like to be co-parenting with this person post divorce?
Yes, it definitely does. I think where you see bird nesting, also being a tool to kind of test run things, is
Right.
when maybe there's trust between the parents in the sense of they respect each other, they trust each other generally as people, right?
Right.
But there's maybe not as much trust on a parenting side. Going back to those gender roles
Mm,
sometimes that we talked about, or even
right.
non-gendered roles, but just share of responsibilities. One parent did more of this than the other parent did. And that parent, therefore, isn't sure that they trust the other parent to be able to do certain things. Making lunches for school, for example. One parent always did it every morning, right?
Okay.
And that parent is saying, well, wait a second, I'm not sure that this parent is going to be able to do that in the same way I did it. You can then kind of workshop those things. All of the same Tupperware is there, all of the
Yeah.
same lunch bags are there,
Right.
all of the same, water bottles are there. So you don't then have to worry about if he or she is going to remember the right water bottle and the right snack bag and, all of those things. All of the same stuff is there. So it's a test run to kind of get the
Yeah.
less familiar person acclimated with how the job runs. And then when you end up separating households, you've now built that trust between the parties that they both can actually accomplish this task, which then means when they're separated, they don't have to worry about it as much.
Mm.
One of the other drawbacks of it, from my perspective, is also aligned with that test run idea. In some cases, you actually want to test run a parenting plan in some ways,
Yeah.
right? And it's hard to test run a parenting plan when everybody is working out of the same household, because those things that then could be hiccups in a parenting plan, remembering to send, Susie's soccer bag on a
Right.
Wednesday because it's a transition day, if you are working out of the same household, you don't have to worry about those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And that's a good thing in a lot of ways. But it also then is a bad thing in some ways when you're trying to acclimate children to
Mm.
having to, live in two households basically. So that's a drawback of it in some ways, is you don't then get to workshop what a parenting schedule looks like and what actually is going to work for the children when they're living in separate households. Um, but it's all just so case specific, right? In some cases, bird nesting is makes a lot of sense. In other cases, it's not going to make any sense. In other cases, it might make sense, but it's not going to be economically feasible. So the thing about divorce is every case is different. There is no one size fits all.
Right.
And that goes back also to another thing we were talking about earlier of the danger of what you read about or hear
Well,
about.
and
It's so fact
right,
specific.
and you've predicted my final question kind of perfectly in that comment, because while you're mentioning, like, all the nuance that exists in any divorce, I'm thinking about, how do you find that right person that's going to help you and guide you? And Kelly, links to your family law group at Pullman and Comley. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
So those are going to be in the show notes for sure. But for people who can't find and hire you, like, how do they? Are there rules of thumb, things that you would tell somebody to look for in an attorney to represent them in these situations, so that you are having this kind of kid-centered divorce that isn't about getting to the finish line of the final award, but is about like setting people up for success long after the divorce is finalized?
Yeah, I think that you have to definitely, do research. You've got to look around. There's a ton of lawyers. Even in a small state that I practice in, like Connecticut, there's oodles of family lawyers. And
Right.
if you just do a Google search, you're going to get, dozens of people. Um, but a lot of it is also like you've got to meet with the person. In our world, we do things that are known as consultations. And I say make sure you're doing that. Before you're writing the check to hire somebody, talk to them first in a smaller scale way, of course, but just get a sense of personalities, because everyone's personality and everyone's style is different, right? I have people ask in consults sometimes, well, are you a pit bull? Are you able to, do this or do that? And
Right.
I sort of say, well, I don't really know what you mean when you're asking
Right.
me specifically if I'm a pit bull. If you mean, am I someone who, can litigate when I need to litigate, but can be, cuddly and cute, like I personally think pit bulls are, at other times, then sure, I can be that. But I think, you have to get a sense of what an individual lawyer's style is and what their perspectives are, right? Because if you're looking for somebody who is going to just yes you, then I will tell you candidly, I won't be that person for you,
Right.
right? That's not my personal philosophy of what being a lawyer means, because as lawyers, we aren't just advocates, we're counselors. And
Yeah.
I take really seriously the counseling part of my job as a family lawyer. And that's going to mean sometimes you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you. And sometimes you may not like it because I'm trying to focus you on the child, right? And not on the fight of the relationship. That really isn't what it should be about when it comes to
Mm.
parenting issues in a divorce. It should always be about what's best for your child. And sometimes that's going to mean the other parent's going to quote unquote win,
Mm.
but really your child is winning if the other parent is winning too. And that's the most important thing. But you've got to get a sense of what people's philosophies are and approaches are. And the best way to do that is to meet with the person. You should never hire somebody without meeting them first. Because you don't know what you're getting into. And it is a very personal, area of the law, and it's your life at the end of the day, and you want to find the person that you think is going to do the best for you, um but also maybe push you a little bit, because that's part of what you're going to have to get used to when you're going through a divorce. You're not going to get to control everything anymore. You're not going to get to weigh in on things that you used to be able to weigh in on when you're living, as a family in separate places. It's different.
Well, Kelly, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and to be kid focused in a world that sometimes has a different definition of what winning means. And again, thank you so much for being on Talking About Kids.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for what you're doing. It's really important to have these conversations, and I think the more good things like this that we can put in the world, all the better.
That was Kelly Scott. More information about Kelly is at talkingaboutkids.com. And when you do visit the Talking About Kids website, leave me a note. I would love to hear from you. The Talking About Kids theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.